Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm appreciative of your time tonight. This is a public listening session to discuss with you the planning process we've undertaken under the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I'm joined tonight by Joe Famely and Tara Martin from Woods Hole Group, who've been our collaborators and consultants on this process. I'm going to start the presentation tonight by discussing a little bit about what the MVP program is and what it's going to do for the town of Mashpee. I'll hand the reins off to Joe to share some climate change projections with the crowd, and I'll come back to the podium shortly thereafter to discuss what the process has looked like for us, what our community resilience building workshop showed, what our findings were, and what the next steps are for Mashpee moving forward throughout the MVP program. So first, I'd like to offer a program overview. The MVP grant program provides opportunities for cities and towns to undergo resiliency planning, and it provided Mashpee the opportunity to undergo a planning process, a climate change planning process, through a planning grant. We were awarded a planning grant through the state of Massachusetts to identify our strengths in terms of climate vulnerability and where we have some weaknesses in terms of climate vulnerability. And through a community resilience building workshop that we held back in November, an opportunity to engage with community members from a broad spectrum of areas of expertise and to identify priority action items that were of specific areas of interest, and that would then, upon receiving our designation as an MVP community, the opportunity to apply for an action grant through the state of Massachusetts to begin addressing these climate-related priorities. Again, this program was created through the Executive Order 569, and it's a community-driven climate change planning process developed by the Nature Conservancy. It's a community resilience building framework that I just touched on before. We opted to collaborate with the Woods Hole Group, who is a state-approved vendor trained specifically in this process. Through the process, the goal is to compile a report of our findings, of our weaknesses and vulnerabilities to the state of Massachusetts for designation as an MVP certified community. Once we receive that designation again, we are then eligible for funding to address those priority items that were identified throughout the process. So MVP has been growing in interest throughout the state, and Mashpee was actually a little late to the program. Cape Cod has, I think every community now in Cape Cod has received a planning grant. A number of communities are working through action grants. And Woods Hole Group, our selected provider, has done a number of these workshops with other Cape Cod communities and facilitated workshops in Falmouth and Sandwich, Wareham, Edgartown, to name a few, and are also consultants within those communities on their action grants as well. So now 71% of the Commonwealth, as you see on the board, is certified as an MVP community, and a number of action grants are currently being pursued throughout the Commonwealth. So how will MVP assist the town? And it's really it provides an opportunity to leverage a lot of our existing assets, to leverage some of our existing planning endeavors and initiatives, including stormwater management plans, our comprehensive emergency management plans, and help with providing funding to both increase our capacity to address items addressed in those plans and address action items identified throughout this process. So looking at Mashpee and its past and present and future, a significant amount of change has occurred throughout the town since the beginning of the 20th century and through 2014, with much of our development activity happening along our coastlines, and some of our most dense neighborhoods occur along Mashpee's coast. And exposure is a key factor in determining whether we consider some natural process or event a hazard. And the development patterns we've seen in Mashpee, dense neighborhoods along the coast, create specific vulnerabilities to the effects of climate change, like coastal erosion, sea level rise, storm surge, wind events, etc. And the impacts of those natural processes can have significant economic impacts on the community. This diagram, this image shows the migration of the Papaneset spit since the middle of the 19th century. You can see outlined in the dashed red line the location of Papaneset spit in the mid to late 1800s. Outlined in the solid black line is where the spit currently resides. So it's undergone a significant change due to coastal erosion and other storm-related impacts and natural processes throughout the last 150 years. So this is a prime example of the impacts that climate change and storm-related events can have on our natural and green infrastructure, which provides significant benefit to our built environment on the land. Hurricanes are another area of interest that will be exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. These pathways shown on the image here are from our 2017 Hazard Mitigation Plan, and these are the hurricane tracks that have affected Mashpee and the surrounding area since the mid-19th century. And again, hurricanes and tropical storms are an area of critical concern within our hazard emergency management plan. These are the list of major hurricanes and tropical storms that have impacted this area again since the mid-20th century. And again, winter storms, nor'easters, all have significant impacts along Mashpee's shorelines and other coastal communities. And these are the winter storms that have impacted the area since the mid-20th century. This is just a couple images to take in the impacts, the coastal impacts that climate-related and storm-related events can have. In the upper right corner, you can see a washout of the Papaneset spit. That barrier beach I showed that graph of, and it's the significant migration of that barrier beach. And other coastal erosion situations. This is South Cape Beach. A washout of South Cape Beach compromised the parking area there. And precipitation impacts, you can see as we have as sea level rise, increased precipitation events, these can impact our ability to travel in roadways, impact our ability to remove water from our built environment. And we're all familiar with winter storm events. Again, climate change is going to exacerbate storm-related impacts. Winter storm impacts will also increase. So, climate change, Massachusetts has observed a number of changes in climate. We've seen an increase of 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit in our temperature. The growing season has increased by 15 days since 1950. We've seen an increase in sea level by 11 inches since 1922. And we see heavier precipitation each year. And climate change, it's not that we won't have warm winters or more or less snow. We're tracking these changes over time, and we're seeing these climate change impacts increase in their trends over time. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Joe, who's going to discuss more of the technical data and the impacts of climate change that we're seeing today.
So these are some scenarios for global emissions that are modeled by the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The state of Massachusetts has been planning for a range of scenarios in greenhouse gas emissions for the future. And those range between this medium emission scenario, which is RCP 4.5, it's kind of like moderate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, to the business as usual case where we keep increasing and building and emitting carbon at the track that we're on. So given what we're seeing here in those historical emissions to date, we're sort of still on that track towards business as usual. There's no reason yet to really believe that there's going to be a significant drop without some major global action. So acknowledging that, the Commonwealth is advising communities to plan on the higher trajectory, but sort of build incrementally into their plans. So maybe acknowledge that there may be some short-term impacts, but there may be some things on the longer term to be cognizant of. And with that, as part of the MVP program, they've developed climate change projections for a number of hazards. So temperature, precipitation, there's a plan to do sort of stream flow, so how precipitation influences stages of streams and rivers, and sea level rise and storm surge. And we'll kind of go through at a kind of high level all of these things. There are detailed packets after we break that has more projections and more detail on all of these things, and we'd be happy to talk with you about any of them if you're interested. And you can take home packets if you like. So in general, there are projections for increased temperature over time in Massachusetts. As you can see on the Cape here, we're a little better off. We kind of get that cooling effect from being on the water and exposed to wind. But overall through the state, there's projections for about a 2 to 4 degree increase in annual average temperature by 2030, and up to 5 to 9 degrees increase by the end of the century. Locally here, so all these projections have been created on a watershed basis. So we have projections that are specific to the Cape Cod area. The annual average temperature could track as high as an increase of 10 degrees by 2100, so by the end of the century. And sort of hot days above 90 degrees, there could be an additional 2 to 9, maybe not extreme heat, but high temperature days by 2050, and anywhere from 3 to 34 additional days above 90 degrees by the end of the century. So these are sort of situations where heat stress becomes an issue and a concern. Energy use may spike as well. All things we need to be thinking about in terms of community and infrastructure resilience. So some of the impacts from these increased heat are heat waves, increased energy use, so higher cooling costs, impacts on human health, changes in how things flower and grow in the area. And some of those changes in timing could have impacts on the ecology. So if a food source is coming out earlier and the thing that uses that food source is here in a different time, there might be some impacts on local ecology. Changes in the growing season could go either way. I mean, there might be more time of year to grow plants, but at the same time, some types of agriculture, like cranberries, need a hard freeze every winter in order to spread sand for the plants to keep up. They're finding that they're no longer able to do that with any sort of reliability. Higher temperatures in water bodies can increase or decrease DO, which causes water quality issues. Vector-borne disease, ticks, mosquitoes, and invasive species are also issues. Precipitation projections are for more frequent and more intense precipitation, more likely occurring in the winter and spring around here and less in the summer and fall. Again, projections for the late part of the century are sort of more in the inland regions of the state, but we will still see some increases here. It's a little bit spotty, as you see from these graphs. So this is total annual precipitation. That is projected to increase up to an additional 5 to 6 inches by the end of the century. Heavy precipitation events, again, pretty variable, but possibly an additional 3 days of these greater than 1 inch events. by the end of the century. And then consecutive dry days, so more frequent and more intense storms, but also more variability in the timing. So there might be long stretches in which there is no rain. So we might be more susceptible to drought over time. So the impacts of some of these hazards could be flash flooding, and then the scour and erosion that comes along with that, water quality issues that have to do with stormwater runoff, potential dam failures, snow and ice damage, et cetera. Sea level rise, again, these are using those emissions scenarios. The Commonwealth is using this high emissions scenario, so those numbers are elevations of sea level over time, but basically it's pretty close to about 8 feet by the end of the century in sea level rise, and increased intensity of coastal storms, increased intensity and frequency. So what you see from this graph is elevation of storm surge along the bottom, and then the frequency or probability on the y-axis. So what you see is at that 1 in 100 year bar across the top. So today's 100-year storm in pink might be tomorrow's 10-year storm in blue. Sort of if you go straight up, they might, the same level of storm might become more common in the future. So Woods Hole Group has been working through modeling the combined impacts of sea level rise and storm surge throughout the state. We have been working with MassDOT to develop a hydrodynamic probabilistic model. So you can look at any point in the town and figure out what the probability of inundation is from a given storm at various time frames. So present day, 2030, 2050, 2070, and eventually we'll be modeling 2100. And towns are using this information, towns and asset managers are using this information to kind of do a risk assessment for their infrastructure. Some of the impacts from increased sea level rise and storm surge: sunny day flooding might, limit access to certain areas. Loss of salt marsh as the tide range moves up. Marshes want to migrate with the tide range. If there's development above, higher than where the current marsh is, then it will be restricted and unable to migrate. Erosion, as we've seen, is a big impact from storms. And then another issue on the Cape here is we have a very limited groundwater source and potential for saltwater to intrude on that. So those are the climate change projections. We have them in packets, and we can talk in greater detail about them afterwards, but I'll turn it back over to Evan to talk about the process.
Folks still want the lights off? Yes? So I'm going to dive into what our process has looked like to date. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that back in November, we held a community resilience building workshop process, again, using the community resilience building framework developed by the Nature Conservancy. This is a community-led process. We worked on specific invitations to a broad swath of community stakeholders to be involved in that process, so we could get varying perspectives and varying opinions and varying levels of expertise to address the climate-related impacts that Mashpee is to face, and begin brainstorming on what solutions and priority action items would be to address some of those problems. I'm the project manager under the MVP program. Town of Mashpee also has a project team composed of a number of department heads and members of boards and committees, and their input was invaluable for ensuring a successful process. And again, we contracted with the Woods Hole Group to assist us with this endeavor, and we are very thankful to them. Ultimately, we had 23 total workshop participants, and we were happy to have them. The first thing that we did prior to hosting the Community Resilience Building Workshop was identifying within the Mashpee hazard mitigation plans, the ranked hazards within that hazard mitigation plan that had specific linkages to climate change and climate change related impacts, and compiled a survey sent to our invited participants. And we asked them to review some of the climate change projections that Joe actually just went over with you in this room. And according to those events that were identified in the hazard mitigation plan, we asked survey participants to rank their level of concern for each hazard relative to climate change. So not surprisingly, coastal hazards, being in a coastal community, rose to the top of the list. In order to cover a broad set of concerns, we grouped these categories into 4 categories so we could address each priority item that the survey had identified, and we did this by grouping them into coastal flooding and erosion. You can see in the blue, those were the hazards that we identified within that subcategory, if you will, or under that header category. Inland flooding, so included things like nor'easters, urban drainage flooding, thunderstorms, dam and culvert failure. Extreme cold and winter storms, and heat, drought, and fire. So grouping them into those 4 categories allowed us to cover a wider, more diverse array of impacts that were identified in the hazard mitigation plan and cover them throughout our community resilience building workshop. Here are some photos and examples of impact from hazards related to coastal flooding and erosion. I don't know why that keeps going back, I apologize. So you can see salt marsh migration and loss, road flooding, coastal beach and dune bank erosion, flooding and damage to public and private property and infrastructure. These are all impacts related to coastal flooding and erosion that will increase as climate-related impacts also increase. Images of inland flooding, stormwater and potential mobilization of contaminants can be impacted. Roads can become impassable due to flooding and failing stormwater infrastructure, and roads can be undermined and damaged due to the flooding. Extreme cold and winter storms, we've all experienced this in some way, shape, or form, but again, as impacts of these hazards increase due to climate change, we can see increased ice damage, safety and accessibility concerns that result from winter precipitation, and down trees and power outages. And heat, drought, and fire. As temperatures rise, populations could experience higher rates of heat stroke. Fires can occur in developed and undeveloped areas as temperatures increase, and impacts to water quality can occur. Joe had mentioned that water temperatures can reduce the amount of dissolved oxygen in water bodies, and again, impacts on ecology that Joe had mentioned earlier. So in our MVP process, after identifying those top hazards, we convened in an 8-hour workshop with 23 participants who broke out into 3 separate working groups, each representing, again, a broad diversity and a cross-section of the community. And first we're tasked through this process to identify the town's vulnerabilities relative to climate change impacts and those strengths that we may perceive, the things we may perceive as strengths within the community relative to climate change. And we looked at maps and listed infrastructure and societal and environmental features that are potentially impacted by those top hazards that we discussed before, and whether or not it would be considered a vulnerability or a strength. And then after identifying what those areas of strength or weakness were, we then convened as a group to discuss and develop actions to address those areas that may be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and what actions we could take that would specifically reduce the town's vulnerability to those top hazards. And then working groups prioritized those actions and commented on a preferred timeline for implementation of those projects. So after identifying what the strengths and weaknesses are, identifying action items that could occur, the group presented to the entire workshop their top 5 actions. They were grouped by topic. And again, these were the top priority actions developed by each of those working groups to reduce vulnerability and build community resilience. And the process identified the following top priority actions. Green infrastructure to build resilience for community and natural systems, protect and improve water quality, update stormwater control infrastructure and design standards, detailed vulnerability assessment for municipal infrastructure, enhance emergency management planning and communication, and evaluate daily emergency access at low-lying roads and culverts. And I want to just note again that these were the 6 top priority actions. There were a number of identified action items that came out of each group that are contemplated and discussed within our summary of findings report that we have available for your review and comment now. And that kind of gets into what our task will be tonight. Again, our summary of findings report is in draft form and our comment period is open. So if we haven't already heard from you, tonight is your opportunity to provide additional input on our final product that we'll be submitting to the state for our designation as an MVP community. So in just a moment, when we wrap this up, we'll break, and if you have additional questions or comments or things you want to make sure that we have and that get included in our draft report, this is what we're doing tonight. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for your participation. And if there are any questions, I'll flip the light back on and then we can have a little bit of a back and forth. And so maybe take a couple high-level questions, then we'll split up into groups.
Yeah, so I think one thing we talked about, Evan, was because next week is school vacation week, we're going to extend the comment period through Friday the 28th.
That's right.
And so the report is available online. That is the website. If you go to the town's website, and it should be it's on the homepage, right? And then also on the planning department.
It's on the planning department page. The link is available on the town's website. There's an email link there. You can provide comments to us via email to my assistant, Patty McGuffin. Her email is included. Yeah, that's about it.
So we'll collect comments on the report either by email or tonight in person or writing. What I'd like to do is take a few minutes and answer any questions that you might have about either the projections for climate change or the process that we went through. If you have specific comments on areas of concern or certain actions that you think we should include in the report as a recommended priority action, we're going to break into groups. After that, you can migrate to either one of those maps or tables, and we can jot down notes. We'll have comment cards for you, stickers to put on the map, notepads, however you want to get your thoughts out. I think we want to do it on those materials.
Any questions? Yes, Rob.
I noticed this, the MVP centering on Mashpee's responsiveness, but I would think the overall Cape Cod regional community would have like a large umbrella effect on what individual towns need to do to participate in the whole region. Can you speak a little bit about who's doing what on the regional aspect? Or is that at another time?
So each town is going through this process. They've either gone through the 8-hour workshop and had their reports approved and become certified communities and are working on action grants or applying to action grants. At the same time, I know that the Cape Cod Commission is thinking about these things, and we've actually been talking to them about how to assess low-lying roads throughout the community, because roads are linkages between communities. The state is focused on the towns themselves and helping them do what's important to you all locally. So that's really the focus. It's like this bottom-up process. There are other things going on at, as I said, at the county level as well as the state. So we're involved in a group called the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team. They're developing design standards for infrastructure throughout the state. So towns will have support from agencies in terms of what you should be designing your facilities and infrastructure to, both for precipitation and for sea level rise and storm surge. So there's a number of things going on, but really the focus of this program is the local communities.
Just to add on that, are there abutting towns to Mashpee that are also under this process, and what are they?
So Falmouth is certified and are working through an action grant, doing basically a vulnerability and adaptation program for Surf Drive. Sandwich is certified and have done a detailed vulnerability assessment for sea level rise and storm surge, and we're working on a communications tool with them right now. So sort of getting some of these projections online and also developing some school curriculum to talk to high school and 7th and 8th graders about climate change. Let's see, Barnstable has been working with the Cape Cod Commission on I think they have either some roads or some infrastructure that they're looking at, and then a number of other communities across the Cape are either certified or have projects going.
Yeah, every Cape Cod community is in the planning grant stage, like we are, and others have already been certified as MVP communities. So all 15 towns are engaging in this process in one way or another.
And the concerns are similar. Like we've been to a few of these. It's sea level rise and storm surge having an effect on the coast. It's stormwater and its effect on both infrastructure and water quality. Those are, and then the question is what happens when both of those two things meet. And I think that's probably going to be the next step in terms of getting information out there. But the concerns and the projects and initiatives that towns are working on are very similar.
Yes.
So you mentioned Falmouth and Surf Drive. Is there any focus with Falmouth on what day? Share the day?
It's not an action grant yet. I think, I can't remember. You can go onto the MVP website from the state and look at any town's summary of findings report from the planning grants, and you can get their top priority actions as well as all the other actions that were come up with during the process. I wouldn't be surprised if Wacoit Bay and water quality and coastal processes was an issue. I just don't remember exactly.
Even though it's a shared bay, there's no collaboration between?
Oh, there could be. There's nothing. Yeah, there's nothing stopping you from
But I mean,
giving the town a call and saying let's work together.
There's no formal collaboration that's segmented by town.
There can be. There just hasn't been in this case. So some towns are, especially in Western Mass, where the watersheds are kind of more formal planning bodies. They've kind of gone in together and done one workshop and then start doing action grants together. On the Cape, it's, I think maybe on the Outer Cape, 2 towns came together and did it, but most of them have been sort of individually. There's nothing stopping you from calling any of your neighbors and saying, hey, let's work together on something.
Is the Concert Island also included in that? And also, are these grants for town projects, or are they also for individual homeowners that might be affected by climate change? Or?
They're for town projects. However, that's not to say that some town project wouldn't affect homeowners. So something you do, for instance, along the coast to protect the coast may have benefits for people that live inland in terms of reducing storm surge.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, if you live on the water and you have a seawall and something happens to your seawall, well, then that now affects your neighbors, the road, all those things, like I live in an area where I know that the street many, many decades ago was built up once and the culvert was added. But I can tell you the last storm we just had on Secaucet Island, I could show you, it was the worst thing I ever saw. I was sopping up water in my windows, and this is the difference I find now. It is the southwest winds have died in the summer that make it really hot, and you never feared the southwest winds in the winter or the fall, but now, like with the Bongo cyclone, that's what you seem to be getting more than nor'easters, I think, is the wind from the southwest.
I wanted to mention one action item that came out of our process but wasn't voted as one of the top 6 priority action items was the development. This is something I think I had mentioned was the development of like a revolving loan program that the town could manage, so we could apply. We haven't made this action grant yet, but apply for a subset of money as a loan or fund program for private property owners to make improvements on their private property to become more resilient to climate change impacts. That's one potential thing that we could apply for the state for. I don't know if that's been covered in other communities before. It was just something that was specifically came out in our workshop. And again, all of the action items that were identified in the workshop, not just the top 6, are eligible for action grants.
And one of those that was low-lying roads, I didn't write out everything that we wrote. You can look at it in the report, but under the low-lying roads, Secaucet was one of them.
Yeah,
So people are thinking
I know
about
the
it.
last
Yeah.
storm, like there was no way you were driving down the road without getting a soft path.
Anybody else have?
Very visual map that show the different assumptions you made about the low-rise areas that are going to be inundated.
We are in the process of releasing those maps. So it's like it's a state-driven MassDOT project, but we have results, I believe, through 2070. This was an example. Yeah. So that's an example of the type of information that's going to be available. It's probability of inundation, and there's also depth of inundation for a 1% chance event, 0.5% chance event, and 0.1% chance event.
So what assumption does that make about the given temperature and associated sea level?
So it assumes that the sea level is in that high part of the curve, so it's higher than the National Coastal Assessment, National Climate Assessment projections, but it's lower than sort of extreme. I can share with you some information that kind of talks about the relative assumptions between RCP 4.5 and 8.5 and ice sheet loss, but it's a conservative projection that is protective but not extreme. That's the best way I can summarize it in short. So if there aren't any other questions, Evan and I will go to different sides of the room, and we encourage you to either use the maps or use the tables or just write some comment cards if you have anything that you're concerned with in terms of climate change in the town. So impacts to infrastructure, impacts to people and communities, and impacts to the environment. What are you concerned about? Specific areas of town, types of infrastructure, and if you have any ideas about what you think the town should be doing about those things, we'd encourage your feedback. Again, the draft report will be on the website and available for comment until the 28th of the month. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.